Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to review the AYANEO Pocket ACE. This handheld came out a few months ago, but I initially didn't make a video about it because the company hadn't sent one out for review. But since then, a lot of owners have been emailing me and asking me to make a review about it just because they want to hear my take on it altogether. And so that's how we got here today. I'm going to take a look at the AYANEO Pocket S and then send it back to its owner. And after spending a couple weeks with this handheld, I can easily see why there are people who want me to review it because it is a nice little handheld. It does so many things well. It's got a 4.5-inch 3:2 aspect ratio screen, which gives us a lot to work with when it comes to scaling for both retro and modern games. It also fixes most, but not all of the issues that have plagued AYANEO Android-based devices over the past couple years. And in this video, we're going to try to cover all that stuff. This will be a standard in-depth review, and so without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump in. Let's start by going over the specs and the pricing. So the CPU here is the Snapdragon G3X Gen 2. This is essentially a more gaming-focused version of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, and we've seen this in a lot of other high-end AYANEO handhelds. For example, on this channel, I've already reviewed the AYANEO Pocket S, as well as the Pocket DMG and the Pocket Evo. All of them have the same chip as this. Like with their other products, they have various tiers of models, going anywhere from 8GB up to 16GB of RAM, and same thing with the storage. It'll start at 128GB and go all the way up to 1TB. The big separation here is the AYANEO Pocket Ace's display, which is 4.5 inches with a resolution of 1620 by 1080. And this is a 3:2 aspect ratio, which is going to be a perfect fit for Game Boy Advance, but then also do pretty well with both 4:3 and 16:9 content. And other than the aspect ratio, everything else is going to be pretty standard. So it's going to run at a 60Hz refresh rate, and it's LCD, not OLED. The battery here is 6,000 mAh, which is relatively large for a handheld of this mid-tier size. And it also weighs 317 grams, which is a little bit over 11 ounces. As far as connectivity, we've got a standard Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.3, which you see with other devices running this chipset. But it is worth noting, like with many other AYANEO products, for some reason this does not have a headphone jack. In terms of operating system, we're running Android 13, and one other thing worth noting is that it does have USB-C DisplayPort video out. Now, even though the pre-order campaign of this device is over, they're still selling these units over at Indiegogo at the early bird pricing. This means that it starts at $340 right now for the lowest tier, which is going to come with 8GB of RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage. The next tier is going to have 12GB of RAM and 256 gigs of storage, and the price goes up to about $420. That additional RAM might be good for some high-end systems, for example Wii U and Nintendo Switch, and maybe some PS3, but for everything like PS2 and below, 8GB of RAM will be plenty. If you want to go all the way and get 16GB of RAM, they have that option as well, but the price goes up quite a bit. So $500 for 512 gigs of storage, or up to $600 if you want a terabyte. And in terms of pricing, it's pretty similar to the AYANEO Odin 2 Mini, which has a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor in it, which is, again, going to be very similar in terms of performance. And yeah, the price here retail is $340 as well for their 8GB, 128GB storage model. It's currently on sale for $329, but yeah, it's within spitting distance between the two. The Odin 2 Mini also has a Pro model, which is similar to the $420 version of the AYANEO Pocket Ace. So that's going to give you 12 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. When you get to that tier, the pricing on the Odin 2 Mini is quite a bit cheaper. In fact, it's $400 retail, but then $370 right now. So $50 less for the AYN compared to the AYANEO. At the end of the day, I would say this pricing is about in line with high-end Android devices at this size and form factor and power level. So yeah, around $340 starting price, very similar to the AYANEO Odin 2 Mini. That being said, it is still a pretty darn high price point for a handheld emulation machine. So let's talk about everything in terms of my first impressions and then the controls and everything else. And when I first got my hands on the device, my number one impression was that it seemed like a mix between both a refined handheld as well as something that is definitely made and marketed for retro handheld enthusiasts. For example, the D-pad and face buttons are up top, which just leads it to be a more natural fit when playing retro style games. At the same time, there are some refinements to it. For example, it's got an all-glass front to it. So you can see here, it's what they call like a bezel-less display, and we see this with a lot of high-end devices as well. It also has a bit of a more modern feel to it because it has the stacked shoulder and trigger buttons, and the triggers are analog. At the same time, it's got a really blocky design to it, like it's just kind of a slab, which we have seen with a lot of lower-priced handhelds over the years. So it feels like this is just kind of a higher-priced version of some of those old Ambernicks. The other thing I noticed right off the bat was that it is quite chunky in terms of just overall thickness, and I don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, it gives it a nice heft, and then also because it is thicker, it doesn't get quite as warm because we've got more space for heat dissipation. And so that's one of the things I've really enjoyed about this handheld as well, is that it doesn't get super hot. A good comparison would be the AYANEO Pocket S, which has the same chipset, but you can see it's a lot thinner. And one of my problems with the original Pocket S is that it got quite warm as I was using it, and that's not been a problem with the Pocket Ace. So I like the fact that it's a little bit more squat and thick. So let's talk about the controls, and we'll start with this D-pad. So this is a rubber membrane D-pad and has a pretty typical feel to it, like you would expect with a lot of these like older school retro handhelds, but it does have a couple nuances to it. Number one, you can see that it doesn't make contact with this glass shell. Instead, it has a plastic underneath, and so you're not pressing down on the glass directly, and I think that actually feels a little bit more retro that way, so I do appreciate that. It's got a fair amount of travel as you press down on it, and it also has a nice kind of thunky feedback to it too, and so I do like the overall feel of this D-pad. However, right off the bat, I noticed that it did lack a little bit of pivot. You can see here that I can kind of press down on the entire thing right here in the center. It does move around a little bit, but I kind of feel like the post could be a little bit taller, maybe like a millimeter in difference. And I did find that the lack of pivot comes into play with certain scenarios. We'll start with the contra test. In this test, I like to press down on the D-pad and then lightly rock it back and forth and see whether or not the character moves. And as you can see from this footage, the character almost instantly moves. And so this is a very sensitive D-pad, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it lacks a little bit more pivot than I would like. When I rock it all the way to the left and right, then the character absolutely moves in one direction or the other. And so for me, this is an indication that it is a little bit more prone to false diagonals than some other D-pads that I prefer. Now, if anything, I would say it's right at the cusp of not being great for games like Contra. And so even though, yes, it is a sensitive D-pad, I did find that in actual gameplay, I got fewer accidental diagonals than I was expecting. A good example here is a precision platformer like Celeste. In this game, the difference between going up, down, left, and right, and then in the diagonal directions can be a matter of life or death. And I found that with this game in particular, I could hit every move I wanted to basically every single time. And so even though, yes, it is a little bit more sensitive than I would like, it's at least to the point where I still find it very playable. I think that probably in some contexts it might be a little bit too sensitive, but I was not able to find anything where I had any major complaints about it. It was a similar story with Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. In this game, I'm trying to get as many diagonals as possible to be able to pull off my Hadoukens and Shoryukens. And even though I did miss some inputs here and there, I felt it overall to be a relatively accurate experience. And so again, even here, playing Street Fighter style games with a D-pad, I found it to be a pretty good fit. So it is a sensitive D-pad, and I wouldn't call it perfect, but I think just in terms of overall accuracy, it is good enough for me. My only major complaint about the D-pad is that it feels like it drops off to a 90-degree angle a little bit more sharply than I would like. And when it comes to playing certain games where you're rubbing across the D-pad, I can feel those corners on each end, and it feels a little bit sharp. And I found that, over a long gaming session, it can be a little bit hard on my thumb. Like with the other stuff we've been talking about in terms of D-pad sensitivity, it really is going to depend on the game, but that is definitely another thing that I noticed. So overall, I would say it's a good D-pad, but it is imperfect. Next, let's talk about the analog sticks, and I gotta say, these are pretty darn awesome. So they feel like they are the same as on the Retroid Pocket devices, as well as on the Odin 2 devices. They are Hall sensor, have a good range of motion to them, and you can also pull them off from the stem. It also has that universal fit for other stick caps, including those from Retroid and AYN, and then also those that are 3D printed from the community. I've been using a lot of sticks from this shop on Etsy. They make 3D printed sticks that can be both low profile and high profile and wider. You've got a range of options. And so, for example, this is the larger one you can see here. It's got a bigger range of motion. I also like the hard feel of 3D printed sticks as well. And so this is actually a really nice fit for me. If you wanted something more pocketable, they also have low profile sticks. So you can pop these on as well. And that's going to make the device overall just a little bit thinner. And the nice thing is that even though they are low profile, they still have a nice wide range of motion. And so that's one of the best things about these sticks is that the caps come off, which allows you to customize it to meet your needs. I love the idea of having low profile sticks to be able to slip it in and out of your pocket easily, but then also putting on high profile ones if you're going to be at home and you just want to have a more accurate experience. And in terms of accuracy, they are spot on. So they have a circular input to them, but I have full range of motion here and no cardinal snapping or any of the other problems that will plague some other handhelds. So long story short, yes, I like these new sticks. I love the fact that they're using them. They've used them on a couple other more recent handhelds. And so I hope they continue to use them just because I love the fact that they are customizable. Okay, next up we have the face buttons. These are rubber membrane and they feel really great. They are relatively flat, but I love the fact that they are easy to press down on. They bounce right back up and they're also not super loud. And so I think just in terms of face buttons, these are very good. They have a nice classic feel to them due to the fact that they are rubber membrane. Also on the front, we've got our select and start buttons, and I love the fact that they put them up top right here because AYANEO has a habit of putting them down here just to make everything look cleaner and more sleek, but I think this is a better position for them altogether. It's a more natural feeling. It's a lot like it is on the Nintendo Switch and Switch Lite. The other buttons down below are function buttons. We've got one that effectively is a back or a home button. We've got a turbo button, which will cycle through your different game profiles, and then we also have one that'll bring up the AYANEO software, and then finally another programmable button as well. Finally, on the front, we've got our two front-firing stereo speakers, and I think that the audio quality on this is pretty decent. Let's do a quick listen. So overall, I think it is relatively crisp and clear. There's a bit of a muffle to it, but it's not as bad as most other AYANEO devices. And so I would say this is above average for AYANEO and about what I would expect at this price point as well. It's not going to wow me and like change my life, but I still think it sounds pretty good. Up top, we've got our volume up and down, a power button, which is also a fingerprint sensor, and then a LED indicator when you're charging the device, and then also our exhaust for the fan. On either side, we also have the LC and RC buttons. These are also programmable. You can have these open up a specific app or do certain functions within the Android software. And then finally, we've got our shoulder and trigger buttons. These shoulder buttons are easy to press down on and they're quiet. So they're basically ideal for me. They're kind of in that Nintendo Switch layout. After that, we have those triggers, which are analog. One thing I appreciate about these triggers is that when you press down on them, they go straight back to the back of the device. A lot of others will go at an angle right here, and it always feels a little bit awkward for me. And so I like the fact that they go straight down into the back. And so this to me feels very good. My only nitpick is that the shoulder and trigger buttons are not textured, and they have been doing that recently on some of their other devices, which I really love. Here's the AYANEO Pocket S2, which is a more recent release, and you can see that the shoulder and trigger buttons on this have this nice textured plastic to it, and I really love that gritty feeling, and I wish it was on the AYANEO Ace as well. It's really a minor thing, and it doesn't actually prevent me from enjoying this device, but I think it would have been a nice added bonus. I think it just maybe came a little bit too early. Also, speaking of texture, on the back we've got a kind of slick plastic texture. This is kind of typical of a lot of other AYANEO devices, and I do wish it was a little bit more matte. You can see that even with a tan device like this, it is picking up smudges and fingerprints from time to time. And so that's one thing to think about, especially if you're going to pick up the black model. I think that's going to be pretty smudgy overall. If I was to pick one of these up, I probably would get the white one just because I like that kind of cleaner look, and I would probably avoid the black one just because of the plastic material that I'm feeling here. On the back, we don't got a lot going on here other than the intake for the fan, and so let's talk about overall fan noise. To start, I will say that the only time I even notice the fan is when using it in max mode, when the fan is going at full tilt. And at that point, it does get quite loud. Let me give you a listen at full blast and then turning it down so you can see the difference between the two. So yes, the fan can get loud, but the nice thing is that you don't actually have to use it. If you bring up the performance modes right here and you go to max, if you just change it from full to high, every time you go into max, it's just going to be at a high speed, which again, I don't really hear at all, and I think it keeps the device cool enough. So unless you're having thermal throttling issues, I would just recommend using max and high, which is the same thing as you will find in the gaming mode as well. It's going to default to the high mode in the fan too. And so long story short, even though the fan does get quite loud at full volume, it's not a setting that I actually use. And so I actually think that this device is pretty good when it comes to cooling and overall fan noise. Finally, on the bottom, we've got a microphone input and then our USB-C port. This can be used for charging. You can also plug in a USB-C headphone because we don't have a headphone jack. And then it also can be used for video out. And setting this up is very easy. If you have a USB-C cable that will go directly into your monitor or screen, it'll work just like that, or you can use an HDMI adapter. By default, it's going to output to a 3:2 aspect ratio, but if you go into the AYANEO settings, under the casting settings, you can actually change that up and make it whatever you would like. So I'm just going to set it to 1080p 16:9. It takes a minute to swap over, but after that, you are good to go. And from there, it's going to work great. It's basically a consolized version of this handheld. You could use a Bluetooth controller if you would like, and then connect to your games and play them from there. If you are using direct USB-C and your monitor supports PD charging like mine does, it's going to charge your device at the same time, which is really convenient. So I think overall in terms of design, the AYANEO Pocket Ace is a pretty darn good handheld. There are a couple things I don't like about it. For example, I think that the D-pad is just a little bit too sensitive and it could use a little bit higher of a post in the pivot. And then I wish it had a 3.5mm headphone jack. It seems kind of weird that a retro-styled handheld that has the D-pad up top doesn't have a headphone jack because that seems like a really retro feature. Now let's do some size comparisons to get an idea of how big this handheld is compared to others on the market. We'll start with first-party handhelds, and I think probably the best example here is going to be the PS Vita because they are pretty similar in size. They're about the same height as well as the same width. The major differences are that the AYANEO is quite a bit thicker, and then also the PS Vita has that more rounded shape, which I really love. The Pocket Ace is a little bit more similar in overall design to the Nintendo Switch Lite, but you can see it's still even more blockier than the Switch, which has just a little bit more rounded curves to it. The Switch Lite is also quite a bit wider just because it is a 16:9 display compared to the more squat 3:2. In terms of retro handhelds, you can see that the Retroid Pocket Mini is quite a bit smaller, but this one also has a more narrow display. And then most of the other small handhelds will be a 16:9 aspect ratio, which makes them wider than the Pocket Ace. Here is the Odin 2 Mini that we were talking about earlier. These two are a similar price point, and they are of a similar size, even though I do think that the Mini is quite a bit wider. The Mini also has that more rounded look to it, which I really appreciate. I think it makes it a really comfortable handheld, whereas this one's a bit more blockier, and to be honest, I think that this is less comfortable than the Odin 2 Mini. Here it is compared to the Retroid Pocket 5. You can see again kind of similar layout in the fact that the D-pad is up top for each of these, but the Retroid Pocket 5 is wider. This is a 5.5-inch display and of course 16:9. One handheld that is more narrow is the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, but of course this one's a clamshell, so a completely different form factor, but you can see here that yes, the Pocket Ace is actually wider than it just because the screen is up top on this one, so kind of hard to compare the two, but this is what they look like side by side. And then finally, one other comparison is the Anbernic RG477M. Now, these are surprisingly kind of similar, the fact that they are both pretty blocky, and they also are not quite as wide, and that's because this one is a 4:3 aspect ratio display. This one is 4.7 inches, so it's pretty massive even compared to this one, but of course it's going to be more suited to 4:3 gaming. You can also see the corners are blockier on the AYANEO Pocket Ace compared to even the Anbernic, which has that more Switch Lite style shape to it. And that does come into play when it comes to ergonomics, which is our next section. So when it comes to the shape and the ergonomics, the first thing to keep in mind is that this is a relatively comfortable handheld. I've been playing it for a couple weeks now, and I've been enjoying it in most use cases. It does have that blockier look to it, but there are a couple nice things to it. For example, it's got this little shelf right here, which allows me to kind of put the thumb part of my palm right here on it, and that does feel good. It's not a sharp edge or anything, and so that actually feels very good here on the front. The stacked shoulder buttons also give me an easy place to rest my index fingers, and so I've got no complaints about the kind of front and top feeling of this handheld. The back is also tall enough to fit my other 3 fingers, although I often will put my pinky underneath just to help support it. I've only got 2 major nitpicks about the ergonomics. The first is that I do think it's a little bit more blocky than I would like, especially up here up top. I feel like if it was more rounded and I could curl my fingers around, it would be even more comfortable up top. It's still fine, but I think it could be even better. Something like the AYANEO Odin 2 Mini is a really excellent example just because this one feels so comfortable. Obviously, it has that PS Vita style feel to it. And yeah, I love the roundedness of this on a mid-tier handheld. I think it's an excellent fit. So it's not really a complaint about the roundedness other than I think it's a missed opportunity just to make this handheld even more comfortable. The only other nitpick I have has to do with the d-pad-centric layout, just because playing dual stick games, more modern games, can be quite awkward because you don't have anything to kind of grip onto here on the bottom, and having the analog sticks down below means that you have a wide grip between the analog sticks themselves and the trigger, so it's kind of like this claw function here. Now, AYANEO does sell their own grip case, and so I'm assuming this will improve the ergonomics, and I've also seen a couple options popping up on Etsy as well, and so I think it's a solvable problem, but on its own, if you are going to try to play more modern games, it can be a little bit awkward. And this is not a new experience, it's the same thing on the Retroid Pocket 5, which has the D-pad up top as well. But the bright side is that when it comes to d-pad-centric gaming, especially retro-style games, it's an excellent fit just because your thumbs will naturally rest on the d-pad and face buttons. It's also very comfortable when using single analog stick games, which will be the majority of things like, Dreamcast, GameCube, Nintendo 64. All that stuff works very well. I think it would be even more comfortable if the device was more rounded around the corners, but overall I've got no complaints about either playing with a d-pad or a single analog stick. At the end of the day, I think the AYANEO Pocket Ace is a relatively pocketable handheld. It's a good overall size, and I think that if you use those low-profile stick caps that you can get on Etsy, it's even easier to get in and out of your pocket. It is going to be thicker than a typical smartphone. Here's my iPhone 15 Pro, so non-Max edition, so it's a little bit smaller, but you can see that, yeah, it's quite a bit thinner. If you have a larger phone, like the Max version of an iPhone or, one of those larger Android phones, it'll probably be pretty close, but I just happen to have a relatively smaller phone by comparison. One thing I've been doing over the past couple weeks is chucking it in my water-filled slipcase. This is made for a Nintendo Switch Lite, and I find it to be an excellent fit. I like the fact that it's kind of a pouch. It's got a magnetic clasp at the top, and so this is how I've been carrying it around. It's been a really easy way to just kind of throw it in my backpack. Now let's talk about the display, which I think is good, but it is outclassed by other handhelds around this high tier. To start, it is an LCD panel, and I think it looks good. I think the colors are well balanced, and it does get nice and bright. This is at 50% brightness right here, and I think it is perfectly playable in an indoor environment. If we bump it up to 100% brightness, you can see that, yeah, it gets quite bright too. In fact, it does get bright enough that I would say that you can play this outdoors in most environments. I think that maybe in direct sunlight it might be a little bit harder to read, but overall I would still say this is a nice and bright display. It also gets very dim. This is at 0% brightness, and you can see that you can basically not see it. Even if I turn off the studio lights, it is very hard to see that anything is happening on the screen, which means that it'll be excellent for low light gaming. Now, when it comes to saturation and contrast ratio, it is surprisingly close to an OLED panel. Up here is the Retroid dual screen attachment. This has the same screen as the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Flip 2, so 5.5 inches in OLED. Now, it's outputting to 3:2 aspect ratio, so it's pretty similar between the two, and you can see that, yes, the colors are better on the OLED. Like the blue is bluer up here up top, and the red in the car is a little bit better than on the device itself, but it's not that far off. So my big takeaway here is that, yes, it's not an OLED panel and it doesn't have those really deep colors like you can see here, but it's still pretty impressive for being an LCD panel. Ideally, I would have loved to have seen an OLED panel on this one as well, and maybe a higher refresh rate, like 120 Hz, so that we can use special tricks in emulation to improve that overall retro feel. But I think for a 60 Hz LCD panel, it still looks pretty good. Another point about this screen is that it's got that 3:2 aspect ratio, which makes it a pretty good fit for both 4:3 and 16:9 gaming. So let's look at Dragon Quest VIII on the PS2, a game that can run in both 4:3 and 16:9. So here in 4:3, you can see that we have some black bars on the left and right, but they are relatively minimal if you compare that to something like a 16:9 display, which has those wider black bars. And so I find this to be perfectly playable. And then alternatively, here is the game in 16:9. So we're going to get some letterboxing, which is these black bars at the top and bottom. And it's really going to depend on, what you're looking for in terms of your game style. If you want to have a wider view to be able to see more, then you can play it like this and have those black bars, or you can play in the original 4:3 if you want something a little bit more compact. Let's briefly talk about the software, but fair warning, this is exactly the same experience as any other AYANEO Android-based device, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Number one, because it's Android-based, that means it's basically going to be like a phone or a tablet, so you will install your apps and your games, your emulators, add your ROMs, use a front end to kind of put it all together into one. I've got an Android handheld starter guide I will leave linked down below, which will walk you through that process if you've never done it before. But essentially all I've done here is I've installed all my apps, added my ROMs, and then I'm using Emulation Station Desktop Edition as my front end, which allows me to navigate through all my different systems and then choose my game and then launch it from here. And beyond just emulation, you can use this for Android gaming. So, things like Minecraft or Diablo Immortal, all that stuff will install on here. If we press this AYANEO button on the bottom, this will bring up the quick menu. So here you can make quick changes to the performance mode, or you could also just press this turbo mode, which will cycle through them as well. You can also do other things like adjust your vibration intensity or change out whether or not your triggers are going to be digital or analog and so on. This is also where you can adjust things like brightness and volume and turn on airplane mode if you would like. Now beyond that, we also have the iOS settings app, which will go into detail about some of those other settings tweaks too. So this is where we went when we were talking about video out to change the output from 3:2 to 16:9. I just went into the device section and then casting settings. And so those are the kind of things you can do within here. You also have the ability to spoof this device and make it pretend like it's some other phone or tablet. That's going to be good when it comes to some game compatibility. Like for example, if a game isn't running because this particular chip is not supported, then you can make it pretend like it's something else from like Samsung, and then it might work. But beware that, that could result in a ban depending on the anti-piracy measures of that particular game. And so it's not something that I personally like to test. The other major function is that you can go into the system update section here and then update your software. And that's something that AYANEO is pretty consistent about in updating their handheld. So I would check this from time to time. The only other thing I would recommend checking out is in the controller section, go into custom keys. This is where you can set your hotkeys to make these be different functions, as well as this one here and also the turbo button. So you can go in here and adjust each of these as you would like. So for example, I have the LC button as my task manager. So if I tap on the LC button, it'll bring up the task manager like that. So just a couple neat little additions, and I like the fact that you can customize it if you would like. Now let's talk about performance. We'll start with a benchmark. So this is Wildlife Extreme Stress Test. So this is a 20-minute test of 1-minute loops and really pushing the device as far as you can go. The highest loop score was 4420, which is about what I would expect with this chipset. And then it does dip down a little bit from then and just kind of stabilizes around like 3850 or so. And that's about what I would expect over long-term use over this 20-minute stress test. That gives us a stability rating of 87%. Personally, I would prefer it to be around, like 90 or 95%. A lot of the other manufacturers are able to get close to 99%, like the Odin 2 devices and the Retroid devices. But this one does seem to shift quite a bit, and that's pretty typical with this chipset. We've seen that with the other AYANEO devices. So my big takeaway here is that yes, you'll get some really awesome performance in the first couple minutes, but it'll stabilize at a lower level after that. And so you may not be able to maintain that really high performance for longer than a couple minutes, but it's still relatively stable. Now let's talk about, overall gaming performance and my experience in testing this device with a variety of different platforms. We'll start with the really easy stuff and then work our way up. Starting with Game Boy and Game Boy Color, these games originally played at a 10:9 aspect ratio, which means that they're going to be a little bit more narrow, so the black bars on the left and right will be a little bit bigger. These games are going to run at a 7.5x scale, which means that they're going to be nice and sharp and crisp, but you may want to use some interpolation shaders if you want them to be perfectly balanced. And the overall display image size is going to be 3.7 inches on this 4.5 display. Now, the one system that naturally has a 3:2 aspect ratio, which will be an excellent fit for this handheld, is Game Boy Advance, because this was a 3:2 system. This means that we're going to get that full 4.5 inches of screen real estate, which does look excellent on this handheld. However, one thing to bear in mind, this is not a perfect integer scale, so it's a 6.8x scale. So that means that, yes, you will still have some imbalanced pixels, which again can be fixed with an interpolation shader. Personally, I think that once you get up to this high of a scale, 6.8x, I don't really bother with interpolation at that point. It just looks crisp enough for me. Now moving on to more traditional 4x3 home console systems, things like, Sega Genesis and Nintendo and Super Nintendo, these are all going to run pretty well. You're going to have some black bars on the left and right, but they will be relatively minimal. The image at this point will be 4.2 inches, so larger than a lot of those 4-inch handhelds, but not quite to the point of that Anbernic RG477M, which has the 4.7-inch display. These will also not be a perfect integer scale. It'll be somewhere between about a 4.5 or a 4.8x scale. So again, you may have to use interpolation shaders or some other CRT shaders, which will mask that overall imbalance. For example, here with Super Nintendo, I'm using the CRT GOM Deluxe shader, which is a pretty demanding shader, but thankfully this device has plenty of power to be able to play these no problem. So you can get some really nice screen effects on your device if that's something you're into. For me personally, when it comes to a 3x2 screen, I think that 4x3 content looks better than 16:9. So something like an old arcade game like Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, I think it looks great. Yeah, you've got some black bars on the left and right, but I can totally live with it. Same thing with Nintendo 64 and Sega Dreamcast, as well as Sega Saturn. All these are going to look really good, but you will have some black bars on the left and right. But again, I think it's something that I can live with. And because we've got so much power, we can really push this up. So we can upscale some of those games, or we can use a really hard and demanding core like the Beetle Saturn core for Sega Saturn, which gives us really accurate gameplay. And again, these all will play at full speed. Moving over to 16:9 content, let's talk about Sony PSP. So this is going to be running at a 3.4x resolution upscale. That's going to be the limitation that we have because of the 3:2 aspect ratio. It's also going to give us that letterboxing, and the overall image will be 4.3 inches altogether. And I think this is still 100% visible, so I do not mind playing 16:9 games on this. In fact, I think this is a pretty fun PSP machine, but I think just in general, 4x3 games look a little bit better. So for example, when it comes to something like Nintendo GameCube, where you can use widescreen hacks and make these games run in 16:9, I generally just keep it at 4x3 anyway. And again, performance here for GameCube and PS2 is going to be absolutely fine. Here in Dolphin, I'm running everything at a 3x resolution upscale, and these games are looking great. And so yeah, this is going to be an excellent platform when it comes to playing things like GameCube and Nintendo Wii. And it's a similar experience with PlayStation 2. With this app, I actually can use a 2.5x resolution upscale, which is more accurate for the amount of pixels that we have on this display. And so that's what I'm using with this app, and I think it looks great. And again, we have the choice between 4:3 aspect ratio and 16:9. And I will say that, the PS2 emulator generally has more widescreen hacks than Dolphin does. And so you can often play more of these games in 16:9, but it'll be up to you whether or not you prefer that over 4:3. And in terms of performance, it should be absolutely fine. I generally play these games in the gaming mode, which is the step down from the max mode in terms of performance profiles, and most games will play well. There are a couple harder to run games where I'll put it into max mode, but in general, I usually don't have to use that. And then finally, my last high-end emulated system I wanted to test out here is Nintendo Switch, just because it's been a bit hit and miss with this chipset. Thankfully, new developments with the Eden emulator have really streamlined the process to the point where this is a very playable system on this handheld and the others that use this chipset. In general, I would recommend using the purple turnip drivers. These are going to be custom drivers you can get on GitHub that will allow you to download within the app to improve compatibility. In fact, the Eden emulator now has this fetch button, which allows you to actually download the latest drivers directly on here. So I've been using the purple ones, as you can see. So literally all I did is just went into here, found the purple ones, and then downloaded the latest edition, and that was it. And after that, I was good to go. And in terms of performance, this chipset still does a pretty good job with Nintendo Switch emulation. Most games you can just play in docked mode, and they will usually run just fine, either in gaming mode or in that max performance mode. A good example would be Super Mario Odyssey, which you can play in docked mode with those purple turnip drivers, and everything looks and plays well, but you will have to turn on that max performance mode, which will affect battery life. We'll talk about that near the end of this video. And outside of emulation, you can also play a bunch of Android games. And so you can boot up, your favorite Minecraft server or whatever the kids do these days, and you can play these games no problem too. And Android compatibility with this chipset has improved over the past year and a half or so that I've been testing these devices. And so now games like Grid Legends, which were not working on other devices with the same chipset, now work perfectly fine. Another good example would be Diablo Immortal. Previously, you could not play this game at 60 frames per second on this chipset, but now you can. It does cap out at the high resolution setting. You can't use Ultra, but most Android-based handhelds can't use that setting anyway. And honestly, with a 4.5-inch display, I don't think I could even see a difference between high and Ultra, and I think that high looks perfectly fine. So I think in terms of Android gaming, it has improved with this chipset. I'm not going to say that every game can play well, but I was surprised to find that every game I tested did boot up just fine. And because this device is running Wi-Fi 7, chances are you can do a lot of nice streaming with it. Now, like I mentioned before, the twin stick setup of this may not be ideal for a lot of more modern games, but yes, you can stream your Xbox, your PlayStation, or your local PC, or even NVIDIA GeForce Now on this device, no problem. Just bear in mind you will have some letterboxing because all of those modern games usually run in a 16:9 aspect ratio. Okay, last section here before we start wrapping up is to talk about battery life. And I did 3 different examples here to kind of give you an idea of what to expect depending on what you're playing. For all these tests, I did 50% brightness and volume, and we'll start on the right side. So this is Golden Sun 2 or Golden Sun: The Lost Age. This is a Game Boy Advance game, and I played it in the balance mode, and this gave me excellent performance here, and I got 12 hours and 30 minutes of overall gameplay when running this game in RetroArch with the LCD 3X shader. So to me, this is a good indication that when playing lightweight stuff, Game Boy Advance, Super Nintendo, you should expect about 12 hours or more of gameplay. Next up, I did Dragon Quest VIII on the PS2, so not the most demanding game on that platform, but still pretty high up there. I played this at a 2.5x resolution and in game mode, so the mode below max mode. And for this one, I got exactly half the battery performance of playing something lightweight like Game Boy Advance. So this one I got 6 hours and 15 minutes. So yeah, this is about what I would expect when playing GameCube, PS2, maybe some high-end Saturn. You can expect about 6 hours plus. And I think that's an excellent amount of gameplay time on a smaller device that has a 6,000 milliamp hour battery. And then finally, I really wanted to push it, so I put it into max mode and started up Mario Odyssey with the Eden emulator and playing it in docked mode. And again here, I found I got about half the battery life of the PS2 platform that we were just testing, so a little bit over 3 hours of gameplay, which I still think is pretty darn good when pushing this device to the max. So in general, I've got no complaints about battery life here. I like the fact that I can get over 12 hours of battery on the lightweight stuff, but still get about 6 hours when playing GameCube and PS2, and then if I really want to push it, I can still expect to play for about 3 hours or maybe a little bit more. Okay, so wrapping up, let's talk about what I like and what I don't like about the AYANEO Pocket ACE, and honestly, there's a lot to like here. Number one, I think it's a good mid-tier size. I like the fact that I can stick it in my pocket, and the fact that I can pull off those analog sticks means that I can also use low-profile sticks too and make it even more pocketable. It also has that AYANEO build quality, which I think just feels overall really well built. It is an expensive handheld, but it feels like it as you hold it, and I love that idea. It might sound contradictory, but I like the fact that this is thick and chunky. It's not too thick, but it gives it enough space so that the heat dissipates internally really well. And so I don't have any issues with ambient temperature on the device itself, which I think is awesome. I also think we have some decent controls. It's not going to be perfect with every scenario, including twin stick gaming, but when it comes to, more focused d-pad-centric gaming or even a single analog stick, I think it feels really good. The Pocket Ace also has an excellent all-around screen thanks to the 3:2 aspect ratio. Both 4:3 and 16:9 contact look pretty good. Neither are going to be perfect, but I think it's a good balance. The performance here with the Snapdragon G3X Gen 2 has always been pretty darn good, and it's the same here. So it's kind of like a set and forget experience in the fact that once you've got your settings dialed in, it's really just a matter of booting up your game, and it's going to perform exactly at that level that you would expect. Now, even though there are a lot of things to like about it, there are a couple things that I don't like about it. A couple of these are actual issues, and others are nitpicks or wish list items. To start, even though I think the D-pad is good, it is imperfect. It's a little bit more sensitive than I would like, and it lacks a little bit of pivot. And so I wish that the post in the center of it was a little bit taller, but again, that's kind of a nitpick. When it came to real-world gameplay, I didn't have a lot of false diagonals, but I can see other people having that problem, so I did want to mention it. One glaring omission is the fact that we don't have a 3.5mm headphone jack. I think that in a retro-styled handheld, it's kind of a given that you should be able to plug in a wired headset, and the fact that you cannot just makes it feel like it's a missing feature. And even though the device is comfortable, I think that the design is a little bit too boxy. I wish that it was a bit more curved and kind of had a more PS Vita style shape to it. I think it would make it even more comfortable. If I had a choice, I also would not have a glass front across the entire front of the device. I think that it does make it feel a little bit more premium, but it takes away from the retro aesthetics. The all-glass front will also get quite smudgy and fingerprinty over time, as you can see here. Now, mine's a little bit unique because the person who had it before me actually put a screen protector on top of the glass, and so we've got like glass on glass going here, so you won't see that in the actual retail model unless you put it on yourself. But still, you can see all that smudging, and so I don't really like that, and I wish it was just more classic plastic here. And then finally, this one is definitely a nitpick, but the device is really great in many ways, but it doesn't have any standout features, especially when it comes to that screen. Many other Android-based handhelds at this higher tier have other features on their screens that I would love to see here. For example, a higher refresh rate, something like 120 Hz, and many will often even go up to 144 Hz. And even though it is a pretty vibrant screen, I think it would have been even better if it was OLED. And then also this resolution doesn't scale perfectly for any retro system. Other handhelds will have a perfect integer scale with certain systems, and unfortunately this one does not integer scale for anything, including Game Boy Advance. So again, I think it's a bit of a nitpick because this is a good screen, but we are seeing some better standout features on other handhelds at around the same price point, and I would love to have seen something like that with the AYANEO Pocket Ace. As it stands, the only thing really going for it is the fact that it's a 3:2 aspect ratio, which makes it pretty good for both 4:3 and 16:9. So in the end, you're probably wondering whether or not I recommend the AYANEO Pocket Ace, and it's kind of a weird one for me because obviously this is a device that I don't own. Someone sent it over to me and I'm going to be mailing it back to them tomorrow. And so generally when I'm in a situation like this, the way that I consider it is whether or not I am in the market to buy the handheld now that I've had 2 weeks with it. And I gotta say that I'm not going to be buying the AYANEO Pocket Ace. I can understand why people love it and I appreciate what it does, but I've got so many other similar handhelds that I don't really see this one replacing any of those others. I love my big, beautiful OLED display on the Odin 2 Portal that can go up to 120 frames per second. I also love the RG477M in that it is a true 4:3 handheld with a 4.7-inch screen that also goes up to 120 Hz. And I think if I'm looking for something that's small and pocketable, then something like the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2 really fits that niche for me as well, because this one is even smaller and then also has that OLED display. And so, yeah, there are many other handhelds that I already own that kind of prevent me from using the AYANEO Pocket Ace to its full potential. So the way I see it, if you're in the market for a handheld and this price point and performance factor are a good match for you, and you want something that's kind of an all-in-one handheld that's a little bit more on the small side, then yes, I can definitely recommend the AYANEO Pocket Ace. But if you're already a bit more entrenched in the whole handheld community and you've already got a couple similar handhelds, then I don't think it's worth dropping everything to get this one instead. At the very least, I can say that the AYANEO Pocket Ace is probably going to be the easiest to recommend handheld when it comes to like a mid-tier size that has plenty of power at that higher tier. And originally I used to say that the Odin 2 Mini was like that recommendation, but I think between the two I would rather have the AYANEO Pocket Ace. The 3:2 aspect ratio does give me a lot to work with, and I also prefer this LCD panel over the mini LED panel on the Odin 2. I also like that the Pocket Ace stays cooler because it's a bit of a thicker chassis, but then also it is lightweight compared to the Odin 2 Mini. This one's about 30 grams lighter. So if you're looking for a high-end Android device that can play all the stuff you want to throw at it, and it is still relatively pocketable, then the AYANEO Pocket Ace is a really good fit, as long as you don't mind the d-pad-centric controls. If you really want to have that analog stick style like the Nintendo Switch, then yes, this might be a better fit. In a perfect world, we would get something like the Pocket Ace that has the roundedness of the Odin 2. I think that would be a killer feature. But as it stands right now, I think these are both really good, smaller style, high-tier handhelds, and between the two, I think the Pocket Ace is the better bet. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Did you pick up an AYANEO Pocket Ace? Are you interested in it? Or do you have something else at the mid or high tier that's a better fit for you? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.